The lawyer cleared his throat and read the will aloud in our living room. When he reached the part about the inheritance, my brother's face lit up like he'd just won the lottery. Then came the part about me. Nothing. Zero. Not a single possession, not a penny, not even Dad's watch. My brother looked at the lawyer, then at me, and I watched a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Nothing for you, Madison," he said loudly, making sure everyone heard. The room went silent. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Aunts and uncles exchanged shocked glances. Everyone stared at me, waiting for me to cry, to yell, to protest. But I didn't. I stood up calmly, excused myself, and walked to Dad's study. I locked the door behind me and sat in his leather chair, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed something. Dad's personal files were still in his desk drawer. Files my brother probably didn't know existed. I pulled them out with shaking hands and began reading. What I found made my blood run cold. My brother hadn't just inherited the money. He'd stolen my future. And now I was going to take it back. I spread the documents across Dad's mahogany desk under the soft glow of his reading lamp. My hands trembled as I read through years of financial records, handwritten notes, and personal letters. Dad's journal entries from his final months were heartbreaking. He wrote about how much he missed me, how proud he was of me, how he wanted to ensure my future was secure. But there were also entries about my brother. Entries filled with concern. "He's been pressuring me about the will again," one entry read. "He says I need to protect him, that Madison doesn't deserve anything because she's too independent. But that's not true. Madison has always been honest. I trust her." Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before Dad died, said, "I need to make sure Madison gets the lake house. She needs stability. I've written it down. I've documented everything. If anything happens, she'll know what I wanted." My pulse quickened. That documentation existed somewhere. And then I found it. A sealed envelope addressed to me in Dad's shaking handwriting. Inside was a letter outlining exactly what he wanted me to have, along with the name of his financial advisor who could verify his intentions. My brother had no idea this letter existed. He thought he'd won. He was about to learn he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I called Dad's financial advisor, Mr. Harrison, the next morning. My voice was steady as I explained the situation, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "I need to ask you something about my father's estate," I said carefully. There was a long pause on the other end. "Madison," he finally said, "I was wondering when you'd call. Your father asked me to wait for you to reach out. He said if anything unusual happened with the will, I should help you." My heart nearly stopped. Dad had anticipated this. He'd prepared for it. He'd left me a path to justice. Mr. Harrison agreed to meet with me the following day at his office. As I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about honoring my father's true wishes. This was about proving that my brother's manipulation had failed. And this was about making sure he faced consequences for what he'd done. I spent the rest of the day photographing every document, creating digital backups, and organizing everything chronologically. By nightfall, I had a complete timeline of my brother's manipulation. Every visit he made to Dad when I was working, every conversation he'd steered toward the inheritance, every subtle threat and pressure tactic. The evidence was overwhelming. And I was just getting started. Mr. Harrison's office smelled like old leather and expensive wood polish. The man himself was exactly what I expected. Silver-haired, professional, kind eyes that had seen a lot of human nature. He reviewed my documents without comment, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he removed his glasses and looked at me directly. "Your father came to me 3 months before he died," he said quietly. "He was very concerned about your brother's behavior. He wanted to protect you. He created a detailed financial plan that included you receiving the lake house, significant savings, and a trust fund. He also documented his concerns about your brother's influence." Mr. Harrison opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed folder with my name on it. He told me to give this to you if the will didn't reflect his true wishes. He said if that happened, it would mean your brother had succeeded in convincing him to change his mind, and in that case, I should help you challenge it. Inside the folder were pages of documentation, Dad's own handwritten notes about his intentions, Mr. Harrison's detailed records of our conversations, and a formal letter from Dad explaining that anything that contradicted these documents was done under pressure and didn't represent his true wishes. I looked up at Mr. Harrison with tears in my eyes. So the will is fake? Yes. No, he said carefully. It's legal. But it was created under undue influence, which is a legal term meaning someone pressured your father into changing it. We can challenge it. And I believe we'll win. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with Mr. Harrison 3 times. We went through everything methodically. He explained the legal process, what we'd need to prove, and what witnesses would strengthen our case. We need to show 3 things, he explained. First, that your brother had the opportunity to pressure your father. Second, that he had a motive, the inheritance. Third, that the result was unnatural and inconsistent with your father's character and prior intentions. We had all 3 elements. We had documentation. What we needed now were witnesses. People who had seen my brother's behavior. People who knew Dad's true wishes. I started making calls. Careful, casual calls to aunts, uncles, and cousins. I've been going through Dad's things, I'd say. I found some interesting letters he wrote. I'm trying to understand his intentions. The responses were telling. Aunt Patricia immediately said, "Your father told me he wanted to take care of you." Uncle Michael said, "Your brother was always at your dad's house, always talking about money." Cousin Sarah said, "I was there once when your brother got angry at your dad for not changing the will. It was awful." Each conversation gave me another piece of the puzzle. Each relative confirmed what the documents already showed. My brother had manipulated our dying father, and multiple people had witnessed it. I arranged to meet with Aunt Patricia at a coffee shop near her office. She was nervous at first, glancing around to make sure no one would see us together. "I don't want drama," she said, but her tone suggested she wanted justice more than she feared conflict. I showed her copies of Dad's journal entries where he mentioned being pressured. I explained what Mr. Harrison had found. Her eyes grew wider with each revelation. "That's exactly what happened," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I told your father it was wrong, that he shouldn't let your brother bully him like that. But your dad was sick, Madison. He was confused. He was vulnerable. And your brother took advantage of that." She agreed to give a formal statement to my lawyer. Then came Uncle Michael, who had even more information. He'd overheard a phone conversation where my brother told Dad, "You have to change the will, or I'll never speak to you again." He'd witnessed the fear in Dad's eyes afterward. He'd heard Dad say, "I don't want to do this, but he's threatening to cut me off." Cousin Sarah added her own account of watching my brother yell at Dad for being selfish and not thinking about his children's futures. By the end of the week, I had 5 solid witnesses who could testify about my brother's behavior. But there was one more person I needed to talk to, someone who'd been present during a critical conversation. Someone my brother didn't even know had witnessed his manipulation. I found Mrs. Chen's number in Dad's old address book. She was a family friend who'd visited Dad frequently during his final months. When I called her, she sounded surprised but happy to hear from me. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," she said cryptically. We met for tea at her house, and she showed me something that made my heart race. Her own diary. In it, she'd documented dates, times, and exact conversations she'd witnessed between Dad and my brother. "I could see what was happening," she told me quietly. "Your father seemed so troubled every time your brother left. I asked him what was wrong and he told me everything. He said your brother was making him feel guilty, making him feel like he had to choose between his children. Your father said he loved you very much and didn't want to hurt you, but your brother was making it impossible for him to say no." Mrs. Chen's testimony was gold. She was a neutral third party with no financial interest in the outcome. She had contemporaneous notes. She could describe Dad's emotional state and the exact words my brother had used to manipulate him. When I left her house, I felt invincible. The case was becoming airtight. I started attending family gatherings again, but now with a completely different mindset. I watched my brother carefully. The way he bragged about the inheritance, the way he flashed expensive purchases, the way he treated people differently now that he thought he'd won. He was arrogant, careless, overconfident. Every time he opened his mouth, he contradicted something he'd said before. "I visited Dad every single day in August," he told Aunt Linda at a family dinner. But Uncle Michael had been there in August, and he mentioned that my brother had only visited twice. I noted everything. I created a document titled Contradictions and Lies, and filled it with instances where my brother's story didn't match reality. I also started subtly reminding family members of Dad's true character. "You know how honest Dad always was," I'd say at gatherings. "How much he valued integrity. Dad always talked about fairness," I'd mention. "About treating people right." I was planting seeds of doubt, preparing the soil for the truth to take root. My brother had no idea what was coming. He thought he'd successfully manipulated Dad, manipulated the will, and convinced everyone that I didn't deserve anything. He had no idea that I was documenting his every word, gathering evidence of his lies, and preparing to expose him completely. I met with a family lawyer, Ms. Rebecca Sterling, who specialized in will disputes and elder law. Her office was professional but warm, and she listened intently as I explained the situation. When I showed her my documentation, her eyes narrowed with focus. "This is excellent," she said, reviewing my organized timeline of events. "You have written evidence from your father. You have multiple independent witnesses. You have financial advisor documentation. You have contradictions from your brother's own statements. This is stronger than most cases I see." Ms. Sterling explained the legal process. We could file a petition to challenge the will, citing undue influence. We'd present our evidence to the court. We'd have our witnesses testify. If the judge agreed that Dad was pressured into changing the will, we could overturn it and restore the true will, the one Dad really wanted. "How long will this take?" I asked. "Depends on the court," she said. "Could be 2 months, could be 6. But Madison, I want to be clear, we have a very strong case. Your father documented his wishes clearly. The evidence of pressure is overwhelming. And we have credible witnesses. I wouldn't take this case if I didn't believe we'd win." Those words gave me more confidence than anything else. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about making sure my father's true wishes were honored, even in death. The real turning point came when my brother started to sense something was wrong. At a family gathering, I made a casual comment about finding some interesting documents among Dad's things. I watched his face go pale. His jaw tightened. From that moment on, he became paranoid. He started calling relatives, trying to figure out what I'd found. He sent messages saying I was spreading lies and trying to manipulate the family. He began destroying documents from Dad's house, not realizing I'd already photographed everything. He grew defensive and aggressive whenever the topic of Dad came up. And with each defensive statement, he dug himself deeper into a hole. Every lie he told contradicted previous statements. Every explanation he gave raised more questions. I documented it all. Every text message, every overheard conversation, every nervous reaction. The more paranoid he became, the more suspicious the family started to feel about his behavior. Why was he so defensive if he'd done nothing wrong? Why was he destroying documents? Why did his stories keep changing? The momentum was building toward an inevitable confrontation. My brother could sense it coming, but he had no idea how thoroughly he'd already been exposed. I'd built an unshakable case against him, and now I was simply waiting for the right moment to present it to the family. At a family lunch, I casually mentioned to a group of relatives that I'd been going through Dad's journals and finding some really meaningful passages about what he wanted for each of us. I watched my brother's reaction from across the room. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted toward me with sudden fear. "What kind of passages?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Oh, just reflections," I said with a gentle smile. "About his hopes for the future. About his values." The other relatives leaned closer, curious. My brother's leg bounced nervously under the table. He excused himself to the bathroom and didn't come back for 15 minutes. When he returned, he was pale and sweating. That single comment had planted a seed of doubt that I could see growing in real time. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what or when or how bad it would be. And that uncertainty was eating him alive. Over the next few weeks, I started sharing small stories from Dad's journals at family gatherings. Nothing accusatory. Just memories that showcased Dad's character and his true priorities. Dad wrote about how he was so proud of my career achievements. I'd mention casually. He wrote about being happy that I was independent. I'd share anecdotes that contradicted my brother's claims. Dad told me he visited the lake house every summer as a kid, and how he always promised himself he'd make sure his children had a safe place to escape to. Each story was a brick in the wall I was building. Each anecdote subtly undermined my brother's narrative without ever directly accusing him of anything. The family members who had already heard the truth from my conversations with them began to notice the pattern. They could see that my version of events, the version backed by Dad's actual words, was completely different from my brother's version. Doubts began to form in their minds. Questions began to arise. And my brother could see it happening. He could see the way Aunt Patricia's expression changed when I mentioned Dad's hopes for my future. He could see Uncle Michael's knowing nod when I described Dad's love of fairness. He could see the doubt spreading like a virus through the family, and he was powerless to stop it. Desperate to regain control of the narrative, my brother made a critical error. He sent a mass message to family members claiming that I was fabricating documents and spreading lies to steal the inheritance. He demanded that everyone stop listening to Madison's manipulation. But in his panic, he contradicted himself multiple times in that single message. He said Dad had explicitly removed me from the will. He also said Dad didn't remember changing the will and must have been confused. He claimed I'd never visited Dad in his final months. He also implied I'd been there manipulating him. The inconsistencies were glaring. If I'd never visited, how could I have been manipulating Dad? If Dad explicitly removed me, why was my brother worried I had documentation? If Dad was too confused to remember changing the will, how could his decision be trusted? The message backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying family support, it made my brother look desperate, paranoid, and dishonest. Aunt Patricia texted me, "Your brother's message doesn't make any sense. He's lying about something." Uncle Michael called, "Madison, what's going on? Why is your brother so defensive?" The tide was turning. And my brother had accelerated it with his own panic. My brother's behavior became increasingly erratic. He showed up at family events looking exhausted and anxious. He'd snap at people over minor things. He'd disappear to take phone calls and come back looking worse than before. I later learned he was calling lawyers, trying to figure out if I had any legal ground to stand on. When they told him I did, his desperation intensified. At a family dinner, he tried a different approach. He attempted to charm everyone, to convince them he was a good person who deserved the inheritance. But it felt forced and inauthentic. People exchanged uncomfortable glances. His smile looked manic. His laughter sounded strained. He'd crossed a line in people's minds. They no longer believed his version of events, and no amount of charm could fix that. Mom pulled me aside that night. "Madison, I know something is going on," she said quietly. "I don't know what you found, but I can see that your brother is lying about something. Your father would want you to have what's rightfully yours. Whatever you need to do, I support you." Hearing those words from Mom was everything. I wasn't alone in this anymore. My mother, the person who'd raised us both, could see the truth, and she was standing with me. I scheduled a meeting with Ms. Sterling to review our case one final time before moving forward. By now, I had accumulated months of documentation, witness statements, recorded conversations, where legal, financial records, and contradictory statements from my brother. Ms. Sterling laid everything out on her conference table and nodded slowly. "This is as solid as it gets," she said. "We have documentary evidence of your father's true wishes. We have multiple independent witnesses who can testify about the pressure he was under. We have your brother's own contradictory statements. We have financial records showing unusual transactions. And we have a clear motive for your brother's behavior: the inheritance." She explained that we could file our legal challenge at any time. But she had a suggestion. "Why don't we wait just a little longer?" she said. "Let your brother dig himself deeper. Every day he's contradicting himself more. Every family gathering, more people see through his act. By the time we go to court, the judge won't just have our evidence. The judge will have the testimony of a family that's watched your brother become increasingly desperate and dishonest. That narrative is powerful." Agreed. Patience had been my greatest weapon so far. I'd wait a bit longer. I arranged a family dinner at my mom's house. I made it seem casual, just a regular family gathering. But I coordinated with Ms. Sterling, Mrs. Chen, and the relatives who'd agreed to support me. I made sure they all understood what was about to happen. I told my mom what I'd found and what I was planning to do. She hugged me and cried. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. As the date approached, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: anxiety, determination, sadness, and a deep sense of purpose. This dinner would change everything. My brother's comfortable lie was about to be exposed. The family's confusion would be replaced with clarity. Dad's true wishes would finally be honored. I prepared my presentation carefully, organizing all the evidence in a logical, compelling order. I practiced what I would say. I centered myself emotionally, reminding myself that this wasn't about revenge or satisfaction. This was about justice. This was about honoring a good man's final wishes. This was about ensuring his voice was heard even after death. The morning of the dinner, I woke early and couldn't fall back asleep. My mind was racing through everything I'd prepared. I reviewed my notes one last time. I checked that I had all the documents with me. I confirmed with Ms. Sterling that she'd be there. I texted Mrs. Chen to confirm her arrival time. At 4 p.m. I started getting ready. I chose professional but warm clothing. Nothing too formal, nothing too casual. I wanted to look like someone confident in the truth. I did my makeup carefully, wanting to look composed and unshaken. I looked in the mirror and took a deep breath. "This is for Dad," I whispered to myself. "This is about honoring what he really wanted." When I arrived at Mom's house at 5:30 p.m., she was already preparing food. She hugged me tightly. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm ready." By 6:30 p.m., the first relatives started arriving. Aunt Patricia came with a supportive smile. Uncle Michael arrived with a knowing nod. Cousin Sarah came with her note of what she'd witnessed. Mrs. Chan arrived with her diary of observations. Miss Sterling came with her briefcase full of legal documentation. And then, at 7:15 p.m., my brother arrived, looking nervous and suspicious. Mom had prepared a nice dinner, Dad's favorite dishes, which added emotional weight to the evening. We sat around the table, and there was a strange tension in the air. My brother kept glancing at me, trying to read my expression. He barely touched his food. I could see him calculating, wondering what I was planning. When everyone had finished eating, Mom excused herself to clear the plates. I looked around the table at the people who mattered most. My family, Mrs. Chen, Ms. Sterling. I took a deep breath. "I need to talk about Dad's will," I said calmly. "And about what actually happened." The room went completely silent. My brother's face went white. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. I stood up. "I'm talking about the truth," I said. "And I think it's time everyone heard it." I began with Dad's personal journals. I read passages where he explicitly stated his wishes for my future. I read entries where he expressed concerns about my brother's pressure. I read the final entry written just days before Dad died. "I need to make sure Madison knows how much I love her and how much I trust her. Whatever happens with the will, my true wish is that she's protected and secure. I've documented everything. She'll understand." I watched the room react. Aunt Patricia had tears in her eyes. Uncle Michael nodded slowly. Mom gripped the table edge. My brother was shaking. Then I presented the letter from Dad, addressed to me, documenting his true wishes in his own handwriting. I showed the financial advisor's records confirming Dad's stated intentions. I presented the testimony from Mrs. Chen, detailing the exact words my brother had used to pressure Dad and the fear she'd witnessed in Dad's eyes. Aunt Patricia spoke next, describing how Dad had confided in her about the pressure he was under. Uncle Michael detailed the specific threats my brother had made. Cousin Sarah described witnessing my brother's aggressive behavior toward Dad. With each piece of evidence, the truth became more undeniable. By the time Miss Sterling explained the legal definition of undue influence and how this case met every criterion, the room had completely turned against my brother. My brother tried to defend himself, but his words rang hollow. "She's lying," he said, "but there were 5 independent witnesses. I never pressured Dad," he claimed, but there were documented examples of his exact words. "Dad wanted this," he insisted, but Dad's own handwriting said otherwise. With each attempt at defense, he dug himself deeper. Miss Sterling calmly explained that we had more than enough evidence to challenge the will in court, that the evidence of undue influence was overwhelming, and that we would almost certainly win. "You can contest it in court," Miss Sterling said, "but I'd advise against it. The evidence is clear, and a judge will see through your defense just like this family has." My brother looked around the table, desperately hoping someone would support him. No one did. Not Mom. Not Aunt Patricia. Not Uncle Michael. Not a single person. He was completely alone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The comfortable lie he'd constructed had collapsed completely. Everyone knew the truth now. His inheritance, the thing he'd been willing to manipulate a dying man to secure, was about to be taken from him. And worse, his character was permanently damaged in the eyes of everyone he cared about. Miss Sterling filed the formal challenge to the will the following week. The court scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks later. In the interim, my brother had a choice: contest it in court and face a judge or concede defeat. He chose poorly. He decided to fight. So we spent the next 6 weeks preparing our case for court. We organized our evidence into exhibits. We prepared our witnesses for testimony. We drafted legal arguments explaining the doctrine of undue influence and why it applied perfectly to his situation. And we waited. During those 6 weeks, my brother's behavior spiraled. He became increasingly isolated. Friends stopped calling. Family members avoided him. He lost his job after his employer did their own investigation into his character. Apparently, someone had mentioned his behavior to his company. He attempted to reach out to relatives, but they refused to engage. He was experiencing the natural consequences of his own dishonesty, and there was nothing I needed to do but watch it unfold. The legal system would soon formalize what the family had already determined, that Dad's true wishes should be honored. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse was sterile and intimidating, but I felt calm. This was the moment everything would be officially resolved. Miss Sterling presented our case methodically. She walked the judge through Dad's documentary evidence. She explained the timeline of pressure my brother had exerted. She presented our witnesses one by one. Mom testified about conversations with Dad expressing his true wishes. Mrs. Chen testified about what she'd witnessed. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Michael, and Cousin Sarah all testified about specific instances of my brother's pressure and coercion. The judge asked detailed questions, clearly building a picture of what had happened. My brother's lawyer attempted to argue that Dad had made his own choices, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge rendered her decision, it was swift and decisive. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of undue influence," she stated. "The documented wishes of the decedent, corroborated by multiple credible witnesses and the testimony of a neutral third party, paint an unmistakable picture of pressure and coercion. The will dated 2 months prior to the decedent's death, which reflects his documented wishes for an equitable distribution to both children, is restored as the valid will of the estate." My brother's face crumbled. It was over. The legal process of implementing the restored will took another month. When finalized, I received what Dad had always intended: the lake house, savings, and a trust fund. I drove to the lake house alone and walked through the empty rooms, touching the walls, feeling Dad's presence. In the study, I found a sealed envelope tucked behind a loose board, a place only someone who knew Dad intimately would think to look. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated just days before he died. "To Madison," it began. "If you're reading this, it means your brother was able to manipulate me into changing my will despite my true wishes. I love you more than words can express. I'm sorry you had to fight for what should have been freely given. But I'm not surprised. You've always been strong and honest. This house is yours. Make it your sanctuary. Live well. Live honestly. Know that I'm watching over you, proud of the woman you've become. Dad." I sat on the study floor and cried. Not from pain, but from being finally vindicated and validated by the man whose opinion mattered most. The restoration of the true will had significant consequences for my brother. Without the inheritance he'd been counting on, he struggled to maintain his lifestyle. He eventually moved out of state, unable to face the family. Last I heard, he was working a modest job in another state, living quietly and isolated. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't feel triumphant. Instead, I felt sad that he'd chosen greed over family, that he'd manipulated a dying man for money. His own choices had destroyed his relationships and reputation. He was still my brother. But some people make choices that have consequences.